So what I'm going to do is we're going to start. I see there's some questions popping up and some comments. We'll be watching for questions, and from the perspective of viewers today or participants, want to think in terms of farmers. How do you seek information? Where do you find information? Consultants. Kim in the video mentioned you're being a conduit. How do you most effectively become that conduit and find and share that information? And conservation professionals, how do you get the information out there in incredible, high quality ways? So I'm going to introduce the panelists. First, and we're going to do this alphabetically because that is the fairest way to go. Belinda Burrier wins on both counts because she's two Bs. She is a United Soybean Board Director from Maryland. She grows commodity soybeans, high oleic soybeans, corn, wheat, alfalfa, and hay with her husband, nephew, and son-in-law on their farm in Union Bridge, Maryland. She also has a small livestock operation where they finish 6 hogs and 3 steers every year. This is her 7th year serving as farmer leader on the United Soybean Board, and she currently serves on USB's executive committee and is chair of the Marketplace Action Team. She also served on the Infrastructure, Trade, and Biodiesel committees for the American Soybean Association. Belinda was elected the first female chair of the Maryland Soybean Board in the fall of 2020. Belinda and her husband David received ASA's Northeast Region Conservation Legacy Award in 2018. She's also involved in Common Ground. So she's got a lot of perspectives to bring to this conversation. Next, environmental scientist Katie Flehive is an agricultural engineer with the Non-Point Source Management Branch of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She works with federal, state, nonprofit, conservation, and industry partners that research, develop, implement, track, and measure the results of voluntary and/or incentive-based controls to improve water quality in agricultural and rural areas. Katie works on the EPA hypoxia team, supports the EPA hypoxia task force, federal co-chair, and is the federal co-chair of the coordinating committee. So I've got some questions about bringing folks under a very, very, very big tent, which is a real art, and I've seen you do it. So I'll be asking about that. Next, Dr. Heidi Peterson leads Sand County Foundation's agricultural conservation team and sets its strategic direction in research, farmer and rancher engagement. She brings significant leadership, teaching, and research experience surrounding agricultural conservation and water quality issues. Heidi previously served as the Phosphorus Program Director with the International Plant Nutrition Institute and also worked with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. She's also an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. She completed her PhD in biosystems and agricultural engineering at the University of Minnesota. Next, Dr. Katie Savinelli is the U.S. Stewardship Team and Pollinator Lead at Syngenta. In this role, she leads a team with goals of advocating, educating, and collaborating for stewardship of Syngenta products in order to provide American farmers a variety of tools. Katie has focused on pest management, product development, and crop protection throughout her 37-year career, has worked in the United States, Europe, and Latin America. Katie holds a BA degree in biology from Gettysburg College and MS in entomology from the Pennsylvania State University and a PhD in entomology from North Carolina State University. And then finally, Dr. Kim Stackhouse-Lawson, who you saw in the video, also is a professor in the Department of Animal Sciences at Colorado State University and is director of AgNext. She received her PhD in animal science from the University of California, Davis, and was a postdoctoral fellow at Kansas State University College of Veterinary Medicine Beef Cattle Institute. Prior to leading the AgNext team, Dr. Stackhouse-Lawson spent her career as a leader and innovator for sustainability program development and strategy for large organizations in the beef industry, including JBS USA, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So I'm going to throw a question in while we look for some questions to come in on the question box. But we'll start with actually the one I mentioned for Katie Flehive. We saw in the video a lot of discussion about all the kinds of voices that need to be around the table. And I know you've worked with some really huge groups in terms of the span of the people sitting around the table, from small farmers to large farmers to policy people, people upstream and downstream. We can bring people into a room, but how do you get them to talk to each other, to really share perspectives in a productive way?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate on this panel. I'm among a phenomenal group of people who are advancing these conversations. That's a really good question. And to be honest, we learn from people like Dr. Linda Prokopi in the video and the other folks in the video about how to do that. The kinds of questions that we want to think about is, how can someone who steps into a room with, folks on the other side of the table, they may not understand why big government is in the room when they're a small farmer, and try to help everybody in the room see it from the other person's perspective. And you do that a lot through storytelling and listening to people's perspectives about what brought them to the table, understand where they're coming from, and then see how we can engage around a common goal. And the common goal that we're working on in the Mississippi River Basin is a very large picture question. And so I think that allows us to bring a lot of people under this very large tent, because we can't do it without everybody.
Now, you mentioned storytelling. So what does storytelling look like or sound like from, say, a farmer's perspective or a policy person's perspective? What is storytelling at something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Those are two different answers, I think. From a farmer's perspective, it can be understanding a farmer leader or a farmer in the community who's had experience in engaging with a said policy or a new watershed type project. And those farmers talking to each other and learning from each other, not from EPA. EPA doesn't need to be a part of that conversation to make that conversation effective. From where we sit, our job is really amplifying those stories and taking, using technology to the limits that it can be used through story maps, GIS storytelling, other ways that can get those messages out to others, far from where those local farmers are actively engaging with each other. And that's really the key, is being able to engage these effective stories in one part of the country. It may be a different terminology, they may use different words in another part of the country, but it's maybe similar reasons that they're doing it, and those little nuances can be picked up on. So kind of talking to that broader audience, just using the technology we have available.
Super. Heidi, I'm going to kind of ask you what your experience has been when you've brought those people around the table too, because you were the one who mentioned it in the video. In the groups that you've been involved with, what's been the most successful approach?
Yeah, I'm thinking back to your original question, Steve, about just what does storytelling look like, and how does it look differently depending on your background. And I think that the current issues that we're looking at regarding the drought that has been happening across the Midwest, getting farmers to talk about what that means for their landscape, the practices that they're implementing right now, what do their fields even look like? So when we talk about storytelling, it doesn't have to be something that's necessarily coming from a true, who we would say is a conservation champion, but really, what are the local farmers experiencing? What are the local issues that are playing into the decision-making process? Because it's easy for somebody who doesn't have that background, the agricultural background, to come in with these misconceptions and the thought that it should be easy. But when you start to lay on the layers of management that has to occur, and the timing, and how you can have everything planned and scheduled out for the year, but then when you look at how the forecast changes, all of a sudden it's all jumbled up, and just you have to start over from scratch sometimes. So I think that that's really important to remember. And when it comes to getting those stories out and sharing them amongst stakeholders, so if we're talking about like a watershed discussion where you're bringing people from different backgrounds together, making sure that the discussion is happening at the right size and it's not overwhelming for any producers coming into a conversation. Because if you have a room of 100 people and they're all from different backgrounds, it's hard to have that opportunity to share your story and to feel comfortable if it's all policymakers around you or agency representatives, and then there's one farmer there to share their story. So I think that that's important too, is the size of the discussion when you invite somebody on board.
So how do you determine what the appropriate size is for a given group?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I look back at a meeting that was scheduled recently for a project that we're working on, and we wanted to make sure that we had farmers present because everybody's different in their operation. Scheduling, first of all, is always an obstacle because there's what time of year it is, what is the crop that's coming off, are they planting, are they harvesting, and so for this meeting we wanted only farmers present because we wanted to make sure that it was understood that they were welcome in the discussion, and we were okay with even having 5 present. So sometimes you can have these great expectations that you're going to have a room full of farmers to get input, but understanding that you're working with a lot of conflicting schedules, sometimes having just a handful, it will be the most effective turnout regarding the information that you leave with, and the understanding of what's happening right now, on the landscape, the conversations amongst their neighbors, for example.
Okay. Now, Belinda, I'm going to kind of point this to you and just continue this conversation about being around the table, because I have a feeling you have been that farmer or one of those farmers and dozens of these kinds of meetings. What do you feel that you bring in with you when you go to these meetings, and either what story do you feel you need to tell, or what are you trying to bring out of that meeting for your own edification when you go to these kinds of things?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay. Well, the amount of learning that my husband and I have done through the years is unbelievable. So we have a total background of USB support, conservation support, the universities. So we use them all the time for our references, and we are very proactive on media responses. We also are active on the social media, so we try to give a united front on everything that we do, and our communications are always unified with the everything that we've learned. I hope that answered it.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So in terms of where you're seeking your information and how you're kind of organizing all of that in your head. Yep.
So a lot of our information comes from the extension, and we use the United Soybean as a source.
That which totally makes sense, and that actually may speak to something. We have a question from Seth on the question box, and it's, how do you engage with trusted advisors? And so when you talk to USB or you talk to your state association or other trusted advisors, how do you find them, and what are you asking for? Or do you just chance into them at these kinds of meetings?
we try to attend a lot of meetings, and we're working on a climate emergency meeting right now and offering a farm tour. So we invite in the commissioners and local media, and we also tap into United Soybean Board and the Extension Office, universities. You tend to figure out who knows what they're talking about, and you take their information. They're not all to be trusted, but you need to listen to everyone to get their perspective, and across the United States we all have different perspectives of how our information comes to us.
I'm not going to let you out of the hot seat quite yet, because you said something really important that I want to follow up on, and that is you learn who to trust. You learn who's credible. How do you ascertain that? How do you figure out that it's more than just great words, but that the information is of high quality?
You tend to be around the same people, and after a while, as you're gathering information, you've already verified it from things that you're doing on your own farm, and that's one of the ways that we pretty much verify the information. And we tend to have the same trusted resources. We're always open to new ones, but it's great to be able to rely on them, and in turn other farmers look to us for the information also.
Got it. So it's a lot of what Kim was talking about, that information moving up and down.
Yes.
I'm gonna kind of take the another question off the question board. It kind of builds on this, and ask Katie Savinelli a little bit about, because you've been one of those trusted advisors through your career. There's an interesting question. What's the biggest challenges you've seen or heard in terms of convincing somebody to adopt a conservation practice? And I know in your current role, you're dealing with pollinators, for instance. You're dealing with something that is not part of the money-making side of most farmers' operations. So you've got a big ask. What kind of challenges have you run into in terms of convincing people to take on conservation, and how have you addressed that challenge?
Well, first of all, thank you for calling me a trusted advisor. I really appreciate that. And also, this is an amazing panel. Let me just, and I talked about pollinators last week, so I'm going to talk a little bit about them, but not completely. And so let me just kind of bring some examples, but take a step back. So I work for Syngenta. It's a large agricultural chemical and seeds company. And when we look at conservation in some areas that we can certainly have an impact on, we look at soil and water as one, as well as biodiversity and habitat, and that's where the pollinators come in. So when the way I look at it, and the way I don't want to say sell the idea, but really convince people, first of all, we as a company can't do everything ourselves. We need boots on the ground. I mean, you really need to have people that are in the area that can do it. And since we're talking about soybeans, I'm going to talk about the other organization. We have done a fairly substantial project over the last few years with Iowa Soybean Association. So here you have a association that's farmer linked in Iowa. So having those key farmers to me is like step number one. But the other part of this is really working across the different groups. So for instance, we're doing what they call an oxbow restoration, which is really like a little part of the creek that meanders that have been straightened out. Now we're trying to put the meandering back in, and it helps this endangered species to take a shiner. Well, first of all, Iowa soybean doesn't have the capability to do that, but the Nature Conservancy has experts to know how to do these oxbow restorations. So that's Iowa soybeans, Nature Conservancy, and then you have the Fish and Wildlife services involved, and these are tends to be the local ones because they also understand the whole aspects around that. And if by having all these groups together, each one brings a different set of information, but by putting it all together, it really makes it worthwhile. And Iowa Soybean has gone out and gotten some funding to do some additional work, so that's kind of a building up in some of the work that Syngenta's resources we've been able to provide. So I think it really, I don't want to say it takes a village because that sounds, but it really takes everybody. But I am I am convinced that having the farmer organizations, when we start doing some of these conservation projects, is really the first step, because they're the ones that are going to say, yes, let's do it, let's not do it. And just to bring in my little pollinator example, we're also working on rusty patch bumblebee, which is an endangered species. And okay, we're creating habitat in Iowa for the rusty patch bumblebee. So I can't help myself. So that's really what it is. But farmers, to me, are the foundation of everything.
So now, working from that and that idea of those, kind of bringing in this wider community or bunch of people with diverse interests and diverse angles in Iowa, say around the Oxbows. Kim, I'm going to go to you because you've had almost the experience in that opposite scale, in that you were dealing with global audiences doing kind of massive changes at an industrial scale. What did you find about either culture, whether it's national culture or just a style of thinking or doing in different parts of the world when it came to trying to move that conservation needle? Were there certain lessons you came away with that are now informing your work in academia and outreach?
Yeah, sure, Stephen. Thanks for the question and for having me as well. It's wonderful to be on a panel of such powerful women. So it's pretty neat. We don't see that very often in agriculture. So little head nod to my colleagues that are on here. So I think when we think about successful kind of international or global efforts, I think we learned this through the U.S. Roundtable as we were building it, the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and then again more at a more at a confined level in the JBS system, but it's similar to what others have said, right? I mean, it's about really building a trusting relationship and presenting yourself as that, right? So I think it's really important to provide these participants with the why, and you need to be authentic with the why, right? And you need to be able to answer their questions and go into detail on the science and help them understand why it's valuable to them. And value doesn't necessarily mean they're paid for it, right? Because we know that in the space of conservation and sustainability, right, the consumer really is not willing to pay for more, but that we've done the due diligence as that trusted advisor, as that scientist, to say there's still value here, there's value to be had, and so as you're kind of able to connect with individuals around the why, and then I am really passionate about empowering them, right? So the JBS system is the easiest example because, again, you're working within the confines of a company. But sort of how we got that started was, for me, I put a ton of time into the benchmarking, and I ran real, our values and stats on historic data at the packing plants, the processing facilities across the globe. And then every single plant manager, and this would be analogous to a farmer, right? If you're thinking about, who's kind of running that local operation, they were given the the information, the why, to make good decisions, but then also the autonomy to make that decision for their own plant, right? So to say, okay, I've been asked to set a goal, or I've been asked to set a target, or I've been asked to implement these sorts of outcomes, this is what I'm driving towards, but giving them the ability to be creative and to work in the landscape, even if it's a plant, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if it's a field or a ranch or a processing facility. These local actors, these people that are boots on the ground, they know the most about that micro ecosystem, right? And they know which levers to pull and which buttons to push in a plant to make it run better. And then most of the time they'll come back and say, okay, you want these outcomes, here's what I need to get there. And then that becomes our job again, right? That's the other trusted expert piece where you say, okay, thank you for bringing me the gaps, thank you for bringing me the barriers, and then you go to work. And I'm not sure we're there yet, right? I think we in this space more broadly, there's a little bit of a gap of how do we begin to bust down these barriers that are implementing or that are impeding the implementation of these very nuanced practices that might be implemented at a micro ecosystem scale. I think that we don't have a lot of funding in this space, right, from an innovative research perspective. So we've got some barriers there. And then the other thing that we haven't done a good job of is really saying, okay, so you've implemented this awesome practice that's meaningful in this micro, ecosystem, and we know that because you're checking all the outcome boxes that we've asked you to. But laddering that up into a broader storytelling message on behalf of food or on behalf of agriculture, on behalf of whatever it is difficult to do. The proof points, kind of stringing all this together in proof points is not easy. I think we'll get better at it, but it's not a perfect system yet, Steve, for sure.
Well, it's job security. We all get to keep trying to figure out what's more perfect. But I want to go to your concept of the levers that you can pull. So whether it's at the plant or on the farm, all these tools, all these approaches, and the speakers in the first hour talked quite a bit about some of those. But we create our own barriers. That was the other term you mentioned. And I'm thinking the barriers that we create, saying, well, you're on my side of this question, or you're organic, or you follow the savory system, or whatever it is. We like to label ourselves because we get to kind of understand what that means. But how do we and really drawing this from the gatekeeper's question that came up earlier in the list of questions here in the first hour, and that is, how do we communicate or move conservation forward without getting into orthodoxies or saying, well, you can't play because you do this or you don't do that? Is there a way to kind of make conservation more inclusive or more effective by not creating barriers or leaving more of those levers open to play with?
Yeah, so this is something I'm pretty passionate about, and mostly because I think when we get very myopic about a specific outcome, right? So carbon is a really good example right now. I mean, we all know it's extremely important, but it's also absolutely not the only thing. It is talked about a lot. So in this space, I get passionate that while we focus on one thing, we don't forget the unintended consequences that might be occurring as we fix one thing. Are we creating a problem somewhere else? So first, I think it's that we cannot get myopic on being single outcome focused. Absolutely not. And it cannot only be environmental outcomes that we have to be worried about, right? We have to be cognizant of the profitability of these individual operators. We have to be cognizant of the rural communities who depend on them and those social networks and how all of that is tied together. And we've got to make progress in a way that is just, right, for that system, for the food security, I mean, for kind of this, for society at large. I mean, this is our food. The other thing that I think we have to be really careful of is that being prescriptive in practices, and while I completely understand, I mean, I worked for a major food company, so I understand the want to do that, especially through marketing and through proof points. And, that's really the way our system is set up. But we have got to be flexible, I think, with sort of the validation or the value of implementation. We've just got to have flexibility around the menu, for lack of a better word, we provide as guidance to ensure that progress happens. I have a colleague here who always says, he's a range scientist, so he understands all of, he's fascinating and very smart. And he always says, I don't necessarily worry about what practice is being implemented. I'm just happy a new practice is being tried, because I think that results in better management of the landscape, right? So it's almost like if you just can continue to evolve and increase attention and do a better job and, kind of move the needle a little bit at a time, we might have more impact than what, maybe we're giving ourselves credit for.
Super. So there's value in continuing to strive, even if it's not necessarily. And that speaks to a question that I think we're going to end on from Seth. He says, explain the value beyond economic value in an agricultural space. And I'm actually going to go around and ask everybody to give me 3 lines or just a few words of what a non-economic value is in conservation terms to you. And Belinda, I'm going to start with you because you are the one closest to the ground on looking at that question.
Well, what I consider value is being able to regenerate our soil. Maybe regenerate isn't the word, but build our soil up and add that the microbes, the soil, organic build. We're not organic, but we have organic practices. So the value would be building the soil, protecting the water, and having a future for the farm further down the road.
Super.
I don't know if I answered that right.
That was perfect, and it was just beautifully succinct too. Katie, I'm going to ask you from your perspective at EPA, what's value that you see in conservation that's a non-economic value?
Yeah, I mean the power of partnerships for conservation to happen at a watershed scale and then to be able to scale it up. Nobody who pays for something in one place is going to pay for it elsewhere in the same way. So, listening, Kim, I really appreciated your comments about listening to what the farmers' needs are and trying to problem solve. That's our job. We have some resources available. We have to figure out how to put them out there. And so, the number one skill that we need is to be able to listen, understand their needs, and know who to call.
Awesome. So we have healthy soil and we have those healthy relationships that you're talking about. So we're 2 different kinds of healthy when we're so far. Heidi, from an NGO perspective, what do you see as kind of a non-economic value?
The list is great. That's pulling together already. And I just had to build off of what Kim was talking about regarding, it's all about system management. So as we're taking into consideration building the soil health and the benefit that provides as a value as our crop yield increases and the crop system becomes more resilient to drought and floods, but also thinking about the biodiversity. How is that creating habitat for the pollinators, for wildlife, for even thinking about our fisheries? And then I think that the real value when it comes to regenerative agricultural practices is when you're the farmer or the rancher and you see the transition that's happening on the landscape and you're leaving it in a better form than how it came to you. So that's the value also, is looking at the changes across the landscape and seeing that future generations have that resource available to them.
Awesome. Katie, I've got 30 seconds. What do you,
Okay.
I know that's mean.
Like my time. So picture monarch butterflies. Everyone knows monarch butterflies. We're doing something with Sand County relative to the youth. I think that's a good way to start. I also think monarch butterflies are kind of the gateway for a lot of this because not everyone, most people like monarch butterflies. But if you plant the habitat for the monarch butterflies, there's lots of benefits for other pollinators too. So even though we're choosing one species, it does help a lot of the other species. So, and it's one of these, very lovely butterflies that everyone is attracted to.
Super. Kim, you've got the other 30 seconds that we have.
Yeah, sure. Just so that all of these non-economic values, which everyone has articulated so well, translate to improved consumer trust and less fear in food products. That's something that keeps me up at night. I don't know if it's because my kids are little or what, but I really hope that people could really trust and appreciate our farmers and ranchers for not just the food that they provide, but all of these other wonderful intrinsic values.
That is awesome. I love the breadth of perspective that you all have shared on even just that one question, let alone all the other awesome insight you've shared. I'm going to do two things at once. Whoops, I did it wrong. I'm going to put in the chat a Vimeo link that someone has put on into the questions box that talks about inviting Gulf Coast fishermen, I think up to Wisconsin, to share a meal and talk conservation, because that just sounds awesome, and I want to make that link available. I also want to thank our panel and thank the American Society of Agronomy for letting us be part of this. If we could put up our sponsor slide, I want to thank our sponsors for making this all possible. As Chris said, that's what allows us to do this the way that we do it. Please check out ctic.org, and you can go through all the 4 tour stops, including this one when we get that posted. In the meantime, all the videos are up and some bonus content. And I'm going to hand it over to Chris to take us home.